February 23, 1945. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima. The smell of sulfur hung over the black sand like a fog that refused to lift. A 21-year-old Marine corporal crouched behind a shattered rock formation, his body bent under the weight of 70 pounds of fuel and steel strapped to his back. His name was Hershel Woodrow Williams. Around him, the Marine advance had stopped completely. 7 reinforced concrete pillboxes sat embedded in the volcanic earth ahead, each one pouring machine gun fire into the Marines trying to push inland from the beach. Sherman tanks had tried to crack them and failed. Rifle fire was useless against 4-foot concrete walls. Grenades bounced off and detonated harmlessly in open air. Bazookas left scorch marks and nothing more. His captain turned to him and asked if there was anything he could do. Williams looked at the pillboxes. He looked at his 4 covering riflemen. He answered with 2 words, "I will try." What followed over the next 4 hours would become one of the most documented individual actions in the history of the United States Marine Corps. Williams moved alone across open ground under constant fire, covered only by those 4 riflemen. He returned to his own lines multiple times to collect freshly loaded weapons, each time crossing the same exposed ground the Japanese were firing across. He destroyed 7 pillboxes in 4 hours. On one occasion, he climbed on top of a concrete pillbox and inserted the nozzle of his weapon through an air vent, killing every defender inside. When Japanese riflemen charged him with bayonets, he turned the flame on them and kept moving. 2 of his 4 covering Marines were killed protecting him that morning. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor, the only demolition specialist trained on the flamethrower still operational in his company that day. But the story of Williams and his weapon was not simply the story of one extraordinary man. It was the final expression of a doctrine that had taken 3 years of hard learning to build, designed specifically to crack open something the Japanese military had spent years constructing deep beneath the earth. The flamethrower was not new when the United States entered World War II. German engineers had been experimenting with it since the early 1900s, and German forces had used it against Allied trenches as early as July of 1915. But the version carried by American Marines across the Pacific Islands was something fundamentally different from what any previous army had fielded at scale. It went through 3 distinct generations between 1941 and 1945, each one engineered to correct a specific failure that had already cost lives in the field. The first version, designated the M1, was standardized in August of 1941. Loaded with fuel and propellant gas, it weighed approximately 70 pounds. It carried 5 gallons of unthickened gasoline and could project flame to approximately 20 yards for 8 to 10 seconds before it was empty. Its ignition system used compressed hydrogen, which failed repeatedly in tropical humidity. The first attempted combat use of the M1 came at Buna, on New Guinea, in December of 1942. Army troops found the igniter would not fire, and the attempt failed entirely. The first successful use followed a month later, on Guadalcanal, on January 15, 1943. After chemical warfare service, personnel worked through the ignition problems in the field. That sequence mattered. Every failure in combat drove an engineering response, and the weapon that Marines carried at Okinawa bore little resemblance to what the service had fielded 2 years earlier. The second generation, the M1A1, addressed the fundamental fuel problem. Harvard University chemists working under Professor Louis Fieser had developed a thickening compound for gasoline using naphthenic and palmitic aluminum soap. Fieser and his colleagues reported the compound to the National Defense Research Committee on February 14, 1942. The first outdoor test was conducted on July 4, 1942, behind the Harvard Business School. The substance was named napalm, the word drawn from the first syllables of naphthenic and palmitic. When mixed into gasoline, napalm transformed liquid fuel into a thick, clinging, burning gel. It did not splash and dissipate the way raw gasoline did. It adhered to concrete, to steel, to the walls of tunnels, to any surface it contacted, and it continued burning long after it had landed. The M1A1, carrying napalm instead of raw gasoline, extended effective range to 40 to 50 yards, more than twice the reach of the original model. It entered major combat for the first time at Tarawa in November of 1943. The third and definitive generation, the M22, was the weapon that shaped the remainder of the Pacific Campaign. It entered combat during the Guam operation in the summer of 1944. Loaded, It weighed 68 pounds. It carried 4 gallons of napalm. Its effective range under combat conditions was approximately 65 feet, with a maximum approaching 130 feet in open terrain. Its decisive improvement over both previous models was a waterproof pyrotechnic cartridge ignition mounted on a rotating magazine, eliminating the humidity failure mode that had compromised the weapon from the start. The M22 fired reliably in rain, in jungle conditions, and in the salt spray of amphibious landings. It burned at temperatures between 1500 and 2200 degrees Fahrenheit. The United States produced nearly 25,000 of them before the war ended. They were issued to men who understood clearly what the fuel tanks on their backs would mean on any Pacific battlefield, and who carried them anyway. By 1944, American engineers had mounted flame projectors onto armored vehicles, taking the weapon off the backs of infantrymen and placing it behind steel with fuel capacity no man could carry. Working at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii under Colonel George Unmacht of the Chemical Warfare Service, CB construction units modified Sherman tanks and amphibious landing vehicles to carry industrial-scale flame systems. The most powerful Sherman conversion replaced the main 75mm gun entirely with a flame projector capable of projecting burning napalm 400 feet and sustaining fire for more than a minute on a single load. The formation that brought mechanized flame to its fullest expression was the 713th Tank Battalion, a provisional flamethrower unit whose 54 Sherman tanks were all converted to main armament flame by January of 1945. Over 85 days of combat on Okinawa, this battalion alone expended approximately 200,000 gallons of napalm in hundreds of separate attacks, at the cost of 7 men killed among a unit of more than 500. The assault team that deployed these weapons evolved through direct combat experience into a specialized formation with a fixed internal logic. In its most developed form, by late 1944, the pillbox assault team consisted of the flamethrower operator, 2 to 4 riflemen providing close protection, a Browning automatic rifle team laying down sustained suppressive fire on the firing apertures, and engineer demolition men carrying satchel charges and pole charges. When terrain permitted, a Sherman gun tank or flame tank added armor in immediate support. The sequence was invariable. Massed automatic weapons fire pushed the defenders back from their apertures. Tank rounds or demolition charges cracked the concrete or opened a usable breach. The operator moved to within effective range and delivered his weapon. The demolition men sealed the exits. No element of the team could accomplish the mission alone. The combination was what made the method work against positions that had survived every other form of attack the American military could bring to bear. To understand what the flamethrower was solving, it is necessary to understand what Japan had built and why. After the fall of Guadalcanal in February of 1943 and the catastrophic carrier losses at Midway in June of 1942, Imperial General Headquarters accepted that Japan could not win a war of attrition against American industrial capacity. The strategy shifted fundamentally. Rather than meeting American assault forces on beaches with frontal counterattacks, Japanese commanders would go underground. They would transform every island into a fortified labyrinth that American firepower could not penetrate from the air or the sea. This defensive philosophy was codified after the fall of Saipan in July of 1944, demonstrated that mass counterattacks led only to mass Japanese casualties. The new doctrine became known as the Fukkaku system, translated by American historians as honeycomb defense, and it represented the most sophisticated defensive engineering the Japanese military had ever undertaken. Its most complete expression was the work of Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima. Kuribayashi had studied in the United States as a military attaché in the 1930s. He understood that his mission was not to defeat the assault force outright, but to make the cost of the island so high that American political will might fracture. He directed 25% of his garrison to tunnel through solid volcanic rock. By February of 1945, his men had carved 18 kilometers of tunnels, with chambers typically 75 feet or more below the surface, and some reaching as deep as 90 feet. Beach pillbox walls were 4 feet thick. 9 months of aerial bombing, followed by 3 days of the heaviest pre-invasion naval bombardment yet seen in the Pacific, left those fortifications largely intact on landing day. On Peleliu, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's 2nd Infantry Regiment of the 14th Division had converted the natural limestone caves of the Umabrogul Mountain into approximately 500 interconnected fighting positions. Many cave entrances were angled to deflect grenades and minimize the entry angle for direct fire weapons. Sliding armored steel doors covered some primary entrances, allowing defenders to seal a position during bombardment and open it when the assault infantry arrived. On Okinawa, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army had tunneled 50 to 100 feet into the coral ridges of the Shuri Line, with the main headquarters buried 100 feet below Shuri Castle itself and interconnected passages running beneath the length of the defensive belt. The assumption embedded in every one of these fortifications was the same. American naval gunfire would destroy anything above ground. American aircraft would eliminate anything in the open. But below ground, in concrete and stone and coral, the defenders would absorb any bombardment the United States could deliver, survive it, and inflict casualties until the cost of continuing became untenable. At Tarawa in 1943, a pre-invasion bombardment of approximately 3,000 tons of shells left the Japanese garrison substantially intact when the Marines waded ashore. Robert Sherrod of Time magazine, who landed with the fifth wave at Tarawa, wrote afterward that it was the only battle he had ever thought the Americans were going to lose. The Fukkaku system was, against almost every weapon the United States could bring to bear, precisely as effective as its designers intended. A Marine rifle platoon preparing to assault a Japanese fortified position had rituals that had become grimly familiar by late 1944. In the hours before an attack, men cleaned their weapons, ate whatever rations they had, and handed off letters written the night before to company clerks who would hold them until the outcome of the day was known. Personal items that would add weight without utility had been left behind. Veterans of previous island campaigns moved through these preparations in a quietness that communicated more about what was ahead than any briefing could have done. Men making their first assault tried not to read the veterans' expressions. The flamethrower operator had a different preparation from the riflemen around him. He checked the ignition cartridges one by one, rotating them through the firing mechanism to confirm each one seated properly. He checked the fuel valve and the hose connections between the cylindrical tanks and the projector assembly. He verified the safety mechanism would hold until the moment he needed to release it. He did all of this twice, because there was no margin for error in what he was about to do. Then he stood up and put the harness on, and at that moment 70 pounds settled across his shoulders and hips, and the men around him looked at him the way soldiers look at someone who has accepted something they themselves know they would not accept. The 2 tanks on his back were visible to a Japanese sniper at 200 yards. Orders issued on multiple Pacific islands designated American flamethrower operators as the first target on any battlefield, to be engaged before any other visible soldier. The men who carried the weapon knew this, and they carried it anyway. The Japanese soldiers inside the pillboxes and the caves had their own knowledge of what was coming. American flamethrowers had been used at Tarawa, at Saipan, at Guam, and at Peleliu, and the accounts of what those weapons did to men in enclosed spaces had travelled through Japanese military communications. Multiple Japanese soldiers interviewed by American intelligence officers after the war stated they feared the flamethrower more than any other American weapon, including naval artillery and aerial bombardment. The artillery could be heard approaching. The aircraft could sometimes be seen in time to take cover underground. The flamethrower arrived in silence until it fired, and between that moment and the moment burning napalm entered an aperture, there was not enough time and not enough space for anything to be done. The defenders had been ordered to hold their positions. The Fukkaku doctrine demanded it. The promise was that the fortifications would protect them. That promise held against every weapon the Americans carried except one. The assault on a fortified Japanese position followed a sequence refined through direct analysis of every major Pacific landing from Tarawa forward. It began with tank and artillery fire against the exterior of the target, which suppressed the defenders long enough for infantry to advance in short rushes. Riflemen and Browning automatic rifle gunners covered the approaches and kept fire on the apertures. Tanks fired their guns directly into firing ports at close range. And then, when the position had been isolated and the assault team was in place, the flamethrower operator moved forward. He moved at a crouch, the tanks on his flanks and the riflemen to his left and right. His target might be 30 yards away, might be closer. He had to be near enough to project burning fuel through the aperture rather than against the exterior wall. At the right distance, he disengaged the safety, squeezed the trigger, and a stream of burning napalm crossed the open ground between himself and the pillbox. The flame entered through the firing aperture, or an air vent, or a crack that a tank round had opened. Napalm did not behave like a bullet. It spread. It followed the interior air currents of a sealed concrete chamber, clinging to every surface it contacted, and it consumed oxygen in that sealed space faster than the air could be replenished. What happened inside a sealed concrete position when napalm entered through an aperture was not simply fire in any conventional sense. The burning fuel depleted oxygen inside the chamber faster than the men breathing inside it could compensate. Normal human function begins to fail when oxygen drops below 12% of its usual concentration. Consciousness is lost rapidly when it falls to 8 or 10%. A 2 to 3 second burst of napalm could bring a sealed position to those levels in moments. Carbon monoxide produced by the combustion compounded the effect, binding to human hemoglobin at a rate that makes even small concentrations lethal within minutes. Superheated air caused fatal damage to lung tissue on the first breath, regardless of whether the flame itself ever touched a man's skin. The men inside the concrete did not need to be directly hit, they needed only to breathe. American combat reports from Tarawa noted something that initially seemed puzzling. Japanese defenders found inside pillboxes after flame attacks often showed little visible burning on their bodies. Their skin was largely unmarked. They had not died from direct contact with fire. They had died from oxygen depletion and carbon monoxide poisoning in the seconds after napalm entered the compartment. The concrete walls designed to protect them from American firepower had sealed them inside with the products of combustion. The feature that made the Fukkaku position formidable against rifles and grenades and artillery was the same feature that made it uniquely susceptible to flame. If defenders survived the initial flame attack by retreating through connecting tunnel passages, American doctrine called for demolitions. Engineer teams moved forward with satchel charges and pole charges and sealed every visible entrance and exit. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, commanding the 10th Army on Okinawa, named the combination. He called it the blowtorch and the corkscrew. The flamethrower was the blowtorch. The demolitions were the corkscrew. Together, they reduced positions that had survived naval bombardment, aerial attack, artillery fire, and infantry assault with every conventional weapon in the American inventory. The method had been established in its essential form at Tarawa in November of 1943. First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr., Executive Officer of the 2nd Battalion Shore Party, 8th Marines, 2nd Marine Division, obtained flamethrowers and demolitions on the first day of the landing and organized his pioneer shore party into an assault demolition team. On November 22, 1943, he led 21 men against a large Japanese command bunker holding approximately 150 defenders. His team fought their way to the top of the structure. Bonnyman was wounded multiple times and killed at the moment the Japanese counterattacked from within. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His action was filmed by Staff Sergeant Norman Hatch, making it among the first Medal of Honor actions ever captured on motion picture film. The footage appeared in the 1944 documentary With the Marines at Tarawa, which won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Short in 1945. The after-action report from the battle concluded that engineer units with flamethrowers and demolitions had been the decisive element in reducing Japanese fortifications, and that each future landing team required such a unit immediately available. That single conclusion, drawn from 76 hours of fighting on a coral atoll, shaped the organizational structure of every subsequent marine amphibious assault in the Pacific. Between Tarawa in 1943 and the later battles of the Central Pacific, the Marine Corps moved with unusual speed to translate combat lessons into organizational changes. The formal after-action analysis was distributed not as an internal document for senior commanders, but as a training directive applied across all assault units preparing for future operations. By the time the divisions that fought at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were assembled and trained, the integrated assault team was not an improvised response to a problem encountered in battle. It was a trained procedure that every Marine infantryman in a Pacific Assault Division knew by name, by function, and by the role he was expected to play within it. The Marines who came ashore at Iwo Jima had never seen Tarawa and were not alive at Guadalcanal, but they carried what those earlier battles had taught, embedded in doctrine and equipment and the muscle memory of thousands of hours of training. That transmission of hard knowledge from one island to the next was itself one of the critical weapons of the Pacific War. At Peleliu in September of 1944, the 1st Marine Division confronted the most sophisticated cave system yet encountered in the Pacific. Colonel Nakagawa's regiment had reinforced natural limestone formations into a connected network extending through the entire Umurbrogol Mountain. The 1st Marines Regiment under Colonel Louis Puller attacked Bloody Nose Ridge for 6 days and suffered 1,749 casualties across the regiment. The 1st Battalion alone lost approximately 70% of its effective strength during that period. Cave-clearing operations continued for weeks after the airfield had been secured and was already in operation, with assault teams working systematically through positions that could only be reached on foot. Nakagawa's final message, sent on November 24, 1944, stated that his sword was broken and he had run out of spears. He committed seppuku that day alongside his commanding general. 34 Japanese holdouts on Peleliu did not surrender until April 21st and 22nd, 1947. On Iwo Jima, beyond the 4 hours of Woody Williams and his 7 pillboxes, the record of the battle contains dozens of actions where flame weapons and demolitions reduced positions that had resisted every other form of attack for days. The complex of hills, east of Airfield No. 2, which Marines called the Meat Grinder, consisted of Hill 382, Turkey Knob, and the amphitheatre. These mutually supporting positions required nearly 2 weeks of continuous assault to reduce. Flame tanks approached within 100 yards of cave entrances under gun tank cover and delivered napalm directly into the openings, while engineer teams prepared demolition charges to seal them. Of approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, approximately 216 were taken prisoner during the battle itself, the remainder having died in the volcanic rock and coral of the island's defense. The Marines suffered nearly 7,000 killed and nearly 19,000 wounded in 36 days. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, the highest number for any single battle in American military history. On Okinawa, in May of 1945, the 6th Marine Division attacking the Sugarloaf Hill complex encountered 3 mutually supporting positions that required approximately 11 assault attempts over 7 days. On the night of May 14th to May 15th, 1945, Major Henry Courtney Jr., Executive Officer of the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Marines, 6th Marine Division, led a night assault up the hill with a company that had already taken heavy casualties over the preceding days. He reportedly rallied his men with the words, "I am going up Sugarloaf Hill. Who is going with me?" He was killed by a Japanese mortar burst during that assault and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The hill was finally secured on May 18th, 1945. American casualties around the Sugarloaf complex reached 2,662, killed and wounded in a single week, along with 1,289 battle fatigue cases. The 713th Tank Battalion supported both Marine divisions throughout the Okinawa battle, and in the final phase at the southern escarpments, poured more than 37,000 gallons of napalm into cave systems over 5 consecutive days, sealing positions that had held against weeks of conventional assault. The men who carried the flamethrower paid a price unlike that of almost any other infantry specialty. The men most essential to reducing Japanese fortifications were also the men most likely to die in carrying out that function. The casualty rates among portable flamethrower operators across the Pacific Island campaigns were among the highest recorded for any infantry role in the war. In one Marine battalion at Iwo Jima, documented records show a casualty rate among flamethrower operators of approximately 92% over the course of the battle. These figures come from a single unit during a single engagement and cannot be generalized across the entire Pacific, but they reflect a pattern that every man who carried the weapon understood before he ever fired it. They picked it up anyway. Eugene Sledge, a 60mm mortar gunner with the 1st Marine Division who fought at both Peleliu and Okinawa, wrote the most precise description of what it meant to carry that weapon. He wrote that the job of flamethrower gunner was probably the least desirable of any open to a Marine infantryman. Carrying tanks with about 70 pounds of flammable jellied gasoline through enemy fire over rugged terrain in hot weather to squirt flames into the mouth of a cave or pillbox was an assignment that few survived, but all carried out with magnificent courage. Sledge knew many of these men personally He watched some of them die at positions his mortar section was supporting. He fought alongside men who never spoke about what the weapon required of them, and never needed to, because everyone who had seen it used understood the same things. His memoir, which he wrote decades after returning from Okinawa, remains one of the most precise first-person accounts of Pacific infantry combat ever written. Woody Williams described his 4 hours on Iwo Jima without military framing or decoration. He said that much of what he did that morning he simply could not remember. He attributed the memory gaps to fear. Absolute fear, he said. He called the flamethrower a terrible, terrible weapon. When he learned that 2 of his covering riflemen had been killed protecting him during those 4 hours, his understanding of the Medal of Honor changed permanently. He said it did not belong to him. It belonged to them. Captain Joseph McCarthy, who organized and led a flamethrower and demolition team against Japanese positions at Motoyama Airfield No. 2 on February 21, 1945, and received the Medal of Honor for those actions, reportedly said after the war that he hoped and prayed there would never be another Medal of Honor issued, not because the recognition was meaningless, but because he knew exactly what it cost the men around the recipient to make the action possible. The critical question the Pacific Record poses is why Japan, which possessed functional flamethrowers of its own, could not develop an equivalent capability or mount any effective counter to the American assault team method. The answer lies in 3 separate institutional failures that each compounded the others. The root of the problem was doctrinal. The Fukkaku system was designed as a purely defensive architecture with no offensive role for flame weapons. Japan possessed the Type 93 flamethrower, adopted in 1933, and the Type 100, adopted in 1940, both workable infantry weapons. But by the time the Pacific Island campaigns reached their critical phase, Japan's strategic posture had become entirely static. Flamethrowers were tools for attacking enemy fortifications. Japan was the side-building fortifications. The weapon had no institutional function within the strategy the Japanese military was executing. At Tarawa in November of 1943, American officers documented that the Japanese garrison had possessed flamethrowers that, as far as could be determined from after-action analysis, had never been used in the entire battle. The weapons were on the island. The doctrine to employ them was absent. The industrial dimension compounded the doctrinal failure in ways Japan could not reverse. Japan's flamethrower production had peaked in 1940 in preparation for a campaign against the Soviet Union in Manchuria that political conditions never permitted. After Pearl Harbor, the full weight of Japanese industrial capacity shifted to naval vessels and aircraft. The capacity to develop napalm, to scale flamethrower production, and to deploy the weapon at the rate the American industrial system was producing, it simply did not exist within Japan's war economy. The Type 100 flamethrower carried no pressure regulator, which meant its range and flame density fell off as fuel depleted, telegraphing the operator's remaining capacity to any observer watching from a covered position. Japan's available weapon was inferior on the one dimension that mattered most, the ability to sustain effective flame at consistent range, and there was no industrial path to close that gap during a war that was already being lost. Architecture closed off the final option. Even if Japan had possessed better flamethrowers in larger numbers, the Fukkaku fortifications had been designed to be defended from inside, not to support offensive flame operations against an advancing enemy in the open. The angled cave entrances at Peleliu were built to reduce the angle at which grenades and external flame could enter. The tunnel connections at Iwo Jima allowed defenders to move between positions and avoid being trapped by any single attack. These were rational features against rifles, artillery, and grenades. They were neutral against an enemy that sealed the exits after delivering flame inside. The architectural sophistication that made Fukkaku positions so difficult to destroy also made the men occupying them impossible to evacuate once the exits were demolished and the oxygen was gone. Japanese soldiers and officers who survived the Pacific campaign and were interviewed by American intelligence officers in the months after the war's end were consistent on one specific point. The flamethrower was described repeatedly as the weapon they feared above all others, more than naval artillery and more than aerial bombardment. American interrogators recorded this pattern across prisoner accounts from Tarawa through Okinawa. Surviving Japanese officers who analyzed in their post-war accounts why the flame weapon defeated the Fukkaku system, while other American weapons did not arrive, At the same conclusion, the Chemical Warfare Service had reached from its own side. The underground fortification designed to be sealed against explosive attack became a trap in the presence of combustion. This was not a matter of doctrine or morale. It was physics that neither side's courage could alter. By the end of the Pacific Campaign, the aggregate human cost had accumulated to figures that resist any comfortable framing. At Tarawa, in November of 1943, the 2nd Marine Division suffered nearly 1,000 killed and more than 2,000 wounded in 76 hours. At Peleliu, the 1st Marines Regiment took 1,749 casualties in 6 days. At Iwo Jima, Marines suffered nearly 7,000 killed and nearly 19,000 wounded in 36 days. On Okinawa, American forces suffered approximately 12,500 killed and 37,000 wounded. Japanese military dead numbered approximately 110,000. As many as 100,000 to 150,000 Okinawan civilian lives were lost. Lieutenant General Buckner, who had named the blowtorch and corkscrew method, was struck and killed by Japanese artillery fire on June 18, 1945, 4 days before the island was declared secure. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy action in the entire Second World War. American analysts and Japanese survivors who studied the Pacific record reached the same conclusion from opposite sides of the concrete. The Fukkaku position's sealed interior, so formidable against every other weapon in the American arsenal, had no answer to combustion. What it kept out, it also kept in. That physical fact, not doctrine or courage or any failure of will on either side, determined the outcome of every cave fight from Tarawa to Okinawa. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the senior operations officer of Ushijima's 32nd Army on Okinawa, and the only senior Japanese staff officer to survive the battle, had been ordered by Ushijima himself to stay alive and bear witness to what had happened. Yahara wrote in his post-war memoir that the American flame tank attacks in the final phases of the Okinawa battle had systematically eliminated positions that had withstood conventional assault for weeks. The tunnel networks, built to allow defenders to shift between positions and absorb American pressure, became sealed traps when engineers demolished the exits after flame attacks. The sophistication of the interconnected cave system, which was the doctrine's greatest strength against artillery and conventional infantry assault, had become its decisive vulnerability against the one weapon the system had never been built to counter. Yahara's account, written by a professional soldier trying to understand his own defeat without self-deception, stands as the most honest Japanese record of what flame warfare accomplished in the Pacific. He survived because Ushijima ordered it. He spent the rest of his life writing down what he had seen. Flame weapons in World War II were used by every major combatant. Germany fielded the Flammenwerfer 35 and the lighter Flammenwerfer 41 on the Eastern Front and in North Africa. The Soviet Union developed the ROKS-2 and ROKS-3, built to resemble standard military rucksacks and rifles to reduce identification at range, and deployed them at Stalingrad and in the Finnish campaigns. Britain's Churchill Crocodile, developed under Major General Percy Hobart's 79th Armoured Division, towed an armoured trailer carrying 400 gallons of fuel and delivered approximately 81-second bursts of flame at ranges up to 120 yards. The Crocodile landed at Gold Beach in Normandy on June 6, 1944. On June 7, 1944, its flame projectors were fired in combat for the first time. Later that same day, reportedly approximately 150 German defenders surrendered under a white flag. What the Pacific record and the Normandy record shared was this: no other weapon produced surrenders at anything like that rate. The flamethrower's power was not only what it did to men who faced it, it was what it did to men who heard that it was coming. What distinguished the American approach in the Pacific was not the weapon itself, but the scale of the problem it was matched against, and the systematic institutional response that problem produced. No other army in the Second World War faced an enemy that had tunneled 18 kilometers through volcanic rock on a single small island. No other military produced nearly 25,000 man-packed flamethrowers and integrated them at the divisional level across an entire theater. No other force organized a dedicated battalion of 54 flame tanks for a single campaign lasting 85 days. The Pacific War created a version of flame warfare whose specific tactical and industrial conditions have not been replicated in any conflict since. The lessons of each Pacific battle fed directly into the equipment and planning for the next. After Tarawa, the Marine Divisional Table of Organization was revised to authorize 243 flamethrowers per division. For Saipan, in June of 1944, CB mechanics at Schofield Barracks converted 24 M3, A1 light tanks with Ronson flame projectors, creating the Pacific's first purpose-built flame tanks, which the Marines nicknamed Satans. After Peleliu, flame-equipped landing vehicles were added to amphibious assault formations. After Iwo Jima, the main armament Flame Sherman became a standard supporting element for Marine Division attacks. Planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, scheduled to begin in November of 1945, included production of 72 additional main armament Flame Shermans organized in dedicated platoons across the assault formations. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, ended the war before those plans were executed. The United States continued to use flamethrowers in Korea and Vietnam after the war. The 1st Marine Tank Battalion landed at Incheon in September of 1950 with a platoon of Flame Sherman tanks. In Vietnam, the M67 flame tank, nicknamed the Zippo, served until the early 1970s alongside the M132 armored personnel carrier, which mounted a lighter flame system on the M113 chassis and saw service with the mobile riverine force on the canals and rivers of the Mekong Delta. In 1978, the United States military withdrew all flamethrowers from service. It was a policy judgment, not a legal obligation. 2 years later, in 1980, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons adopted Protocol 3 on incendiary weapons, which restricted their use against civilian populations and military targets in civilian concentrations. The United States ratified Protocol 3 in 2009 with a reservation preserving the right to use incendiary weapons against military objectives in civilian areas, when doing so would reduce overall casualties compared to available alternatives. Hershel Woodrow Williams lived to become the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Second World War. He spent the decades after returning from Iwo Jima visiting Gold Star families, the families of American service members killed in action, and he established a foundation to support the construction of Gold Star family memorial monuments at veterans' cemeteries across the country. A United States Navy Expeditionary Base mobile ship, designated ES-B4, was commissioned in his name on the 7th of March, 2020. He died on June 29, 2022, at the age of 98. He lay in honor in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington on July 14, 2022. His Medal of Honor is displayed at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in Chicago. He said near the end of his life that any time you take a life, there is always some aftermath if you have any heart at all. He said it is one of those things you put in the recess of your mind. He had done it in 4 hours on a single February morning in 1945 and carried it quietly for the next 77 years. Eugene Sledge returned from Okinawa, finished his education, and spent his career teaching biology at the University of Montevallo in Alabama. He wrote his memoir because he believed the men who did not come back deserved a record that did not soften what had happened to them. He died on March 3, 2001. The National Museum of the Marine Corps at Quantico, Virginia, holds original M22 flamethrowers and flame tank artifacts in its Pacific War galleries, presented alongside the accounts of the men who carried them and the conditions that made their use necessary. Each year, on the anniversary of the Iwo Jima landing, the Marine Corps marks the day. Each year, the number of men who can remember what it was like to stand in black volcanic sand with 70 pounds on their backs and move toward a concrete pillbox grows smaller, and the obligation to understand what they did passes further into the keeping of those who were not there. The flamethrower did not win the Pacific War. No single weapon wins a war. What it did was solve one specific problem that nothing else available could solve. The problem of an enemy that had placed itself beyond the reach of conventional firepower by going underground into rock and concrete far enough that naval guns and aerial bombs could not follow. The Marine assault teams that moved across Iwo Jima and the coral ridges of Peleliu and the escarpments of Okinawa with flame weapons on their backs were not indifferent to what they were doing. The accounts they left are full of the weight of it. Sledge wrote that something died in him at Peleliu, That line was not a figure of speech. It was a fact report from a man who said what he meant and meant exactly what he said. The men who survived carried the knowledge of what they had done and what they had seen, and they carried it for the rest of their lives. What remains striking, seen across 8 decades, is how completely the outcome was shaped by a mismatch of tools. Japan built the most sophisticated underground defensive system in the history of island warfare, and that system was, against almost every American weapon, precisely as effective as it was designed to be. The pre-invasion bombardment statistics from the Pacific landings are sobering in this regard. Thousands of tons of naval shells delivered over days or weeks, followed by assault troops who found defenders still alive in the darkness below the rubble and still fighting. The Fukkaku fortifications did what they were built to do. The flaw in the design was not tactical, it was physical. A sealed underground space that sustained human life also sustained combustion, and combustion in a sealed space depletes oxygen and produces carbon monoxide, and no order from Imperial General Headquarters changes the chemistry of what happens when napalm burns inside an enclosed chamber. The soldiers who died inside those positions were not abstractions. The Japanese men who had been ordered underground and told to hold until death had their own letters undelivered, their own preparations before battle, their own understanding of what duty required of them. Kuribayashi sent his final operational message to Imperial General Headquarters on March 17, 1945. 8 days later, he led the last attack that ended his life. He had done what a professional soldier could do with the resources and the doctrine he had been given, against an enemy that had found the one tool the Fukkaku system had never been designed to counter. The flamethrower has been absent from American military service for nearly 50 years. The men who carried it are almost all gone now. What remains is the record they made, in after-action reports and chemical warfare service monographs and Medal of Honor citations, and the memoirs of the men who survived long enough to write them. That record does not ask for glory. It does not ask to be remembered as anything other than what it was, a specific and costly solution to a specific and terrible problem, paid for by men on both sides of the flame, on islands far from home, in a war whose full accounting no single document will ever complete. What it does ask, and what it deserves, is to be read accurately, and to be understood for what it actually cost, in treasure and in lives, and in the weight that the men who came home carried quietly for the rest of their days.